The Portland State University Oral History Project about Oregon's land use planning program provides the opportunity for key participants to recount the stories and anecdotes regarding how this unique program was developed, implemented, and evolved over its more than 4 decades in existence. It is April 24th, 2017. My name is Michael Rupp. I am a former member of the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and in my earlier years I was a staff member of the Douglas County Planning Department. It is my pleasure to be interviewing today my former colleague and mentor, James B. Knight. Jim was one of the original staff members with the Department of Land Conservation and Development and held a number of positions at DLCD until he retired after 29 years. Jim was honored by the Oregon Chapter of American Planning Association in 2001 with the Distinguished Leadership Award by a professional planner for his service to the planning profession in the state of Oregon. Welcome, and thanks for agreeing to be interviewed.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, let's start with a brief personal background about how you and your family settled here in Oregon.
Let's see, is that a long story or a short story?
Maybe,
she's over here, she's going to check me
maybe
if I
both.
say nothing wrong.
Yes, Pat's here listening to this. So.
As you said in your opening remarks, I came to Oregon in 1974.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, at that point, still living in my hometown of Buffalo, New York. And my wife and I met each other back there, wife-to-be, and we went out for about a year, I think, and she finally said, where are we going with our relationship? So, and she said, I'm going to return to the West Coast, where she was born and raised, and she said, I want to go to Oregon. And so, my family history is that my mother was born an Oregonian, and she and my dad met in San Francisco during World War II. She was a Navy wave. My father was flying in a patrol plane. Anyway, back there they found romance, and so I think...
So you had roots on the West Coast, basically.
Came out a couple times, once as a 7-year-old with my family, you know, and I was one of 2 brothers, and my brother was 4 years old, and came out several times after that, and so we got to see Oregon, and a lot to see and be proud of, and exciting and so forth.
So you were educated back in the East Coast, though.
I was.
Okay.
And so
you went
to high school, and my elementary and high school in Buffalo, and then went to Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from Erie.
Okay.
If you know your geography.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cold winters.
Cold winters and so forth. And then went to Syracuse University for my master's degree. And then returned to Buffalo to work for the county government then, for the county planning division. And in my last year or so, I moved upstairs, so to speak, in terms of the county office building, to work with the Office for the Aging. So I had some social work.
So you had planning, land use experience, and
that's right.
Social planning experience.
And then along came this opportunity to get work in Oregon.
Yeah, to move to the West Coast.
So I sent out a bunch of interesting letters of inquiry, I should say.
Okay.
And one letter went to a fellow we know and worked for many years, Jim Ross, who was at that time the director of the Coastal Zone program on the coast.
OCC and DC. I worked with, from Douglas County, I worked with them quite a bit.
Right.
Yeah, Oregon Coastal Conservation Development Commission.
And Jim was very kind and said, I don't have anything for you, but you may want to speak to a personal friend and colleague of mine, Arnold Kogan, who, as we both know, was director of DLCD.
The first director.
Yeah, the first one, right. And
so you came out, you got employed in '74. Senate Bill 100 was adopted in
73.
73.
Correct. So the agency, was formed legally, I guess, or technically, months before I got here.
Right.
But we only had a few people on staff at that time. I think it was like 10 or less. And none of the overall superstructure, so to speak, of the program and the agency. And
So all they had was the legislation, but there was no program per se.
the thing that we were working on back in the latter part of 1974 was the adoption of the statewide planning goals. And so
That was basically your first assignment?
first assignment along with the rest of the staff. And
Okay.
We spent some very, very hectic months of 74 and came to the end of 74 and the final hearing before the LCDC, and which was going to be culminating in the adoption of the draft goals.
Okay.
We had 14 subjects at that time.
Okay.
And
Before we go there, let me explore a little bit how you, the discussions about what issues were going to become goals. Because when I was working in Douglas County, I remember hearings that were held out at Umpqua Community College, and staff from DLCD, and I don't remember who the staff people were, but they came down to say, I remember the whiteboards and what issues are
important.
the state's interests, I guess is the term
Right.
you and I have
Right,
used
yeah.
before.
We, as the time went on, those last few months of 74, we got down to a list of 14. And we were having some difficulty getting consensus within the commission to some extent, but also getting agreement by the outside
Right.
community,
Stakeholders and interests of
local governments,
local governments.
interest groups, and so forth. And so
Were some goals non-controversial and no one had a problem with, and others were the things that most of the energy was focused?
I think almost every goal, more or less, had some controversy or at least a lot of concern or interest. And we had the first two goals, citizen involvement in the planning process, goal 2, and then 6 other goals that were focused primarily on urban type issues, although not exclusively, and the other 6 on, I would say, general issues
Right.
that would apply both urban and rural, but particularly rural, such as the forest land goal and
Right.
goal 4.
Goal 3 with
forestry goal,
agricultural land.
and so forth. So,
Yeah.
and because we were getting a consensus with interest groups, the commission decided to form some advisory committees,
Okay.
one for each goal. So I was assigned staff responsibility for 6 goals, and my colleague Brent Lake was assigned responsibility for the other 6.
Wow. So you actually had hearings or
We had
subcommittee meetings
and so
on each of the different
the panels
goals?
would meet, right,
Wow.
around the state to some extent.
Yeah.
And some of these were some of the key players, and we had, I think, one or more commissioners would actually participate in some of the panels.
Uh-huh.
And so we got a lot of work thrown at us and trying to find a solid piece of policy work, but also to get some consensus.
Yeah.
And
How did they divvy the group? I mean, you had 6. Were your 6 urban or rural, and Brent's were the others?
Mine was basically urban,
Okay.
and Brent's was largely rural.
Okay.
But again, some of the goals, like let's say goal 7, which was I think under Brent's arm,
Yeah.
which was for those that,
Sure.
that you know what goal 7 is in terms of natural hazards.
Right.
And natural hazards
Apply
are not
to-
unique to
Right.
cities
It applies
or
to
counties. They
everybody.
apply, 8 goal, was recreation.
Yeah.
9 economic development. So I would have that one.
Yeah.
And I had 10, and I had 11, and I had 12. And I had, I think 13. Pretty sure I had that.
Yeah.
And of course, probably one of the more key goals was 14,
Right.
urban. And we had the citizen involvement goal was, let's see, I forget her name now. Cindy Banzer.
Cindy, I was going to
Right.
say. Yeah.
And then Kathleen Carter had goal 2,
Okay.
which in some ways is a very, very key goal.
Kind of the omnibus of the...
Well, it more or less was laying out the process,
Yeah.
and the steps and so forth, and it didn't have any substantive quality to it. Not quality, but, content.
Right.
It was basically how the planning process was going to be worked between local governments and ourselves.
Somewhat the structure
and the directions that local governments would have to adhere to, and others.
Yeah.
And so that was all 14. And we came to December of 74. And the latter half, it wasn't Christmas time yet, but it was the holiday season. And we had, I think I've told you this before, on the final hearing, we had sitting side by side, outgoing Governor McCall, incoming Governor Sprout. Governor McCall couldn't run again.
Right.
He had run.
And McCall, by the way, was a Republican and Sprout was a Democrat.
That's exactly right.
Which
they were sitting side by side before the commission, both of them urging the commission's adoption of the 14 goals.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a lot of detail or technical stuff gotten into. We were almost past that point, at least for them. But to have those two leaders, as you were saying, Democrat and Republican, side by side, urging the commission to act, to approve, I thought was pretty darn moving.
Really?
Very staff.
Very historic.
It was historic, and that was, they were followed by other people testifying. Most of them, I think, were in favor of what we were going to adopt, the commission was going to adopt.
Yeah.
And we had, some names on the commission, Jim Ross and Jim Smart, L.B. Day, Steve Shell, people like that.
Yeah.
And they adopted the goals. So they were, in effect, January 1, 1975.
Okay, so you had the goals adopted. What next? I mean, how did the process start evolving?
Well, we didn't have a lot of guidance, and that is to say, we didn't have such as staff people who would maybe join the agency staff a year or two down the road. We were just beginning, and so we started devising ways to inform local governments. Here are the goals, and more importantly, in some ways, here's how they're going to be used and how they're supposed to be followed. And we didn't have anything that we could just go from a book or something. We had to sort of, go, not make it up, but basically give information out, and we have meetings and so forth, and start explaining how we're going to proceed.
Yeah.
And that was the creative aspect of this. Is, okay, here are the goals. You have a year, or whatever the law said at that time. I think Senate Bill 100 said 1 year.
I think so, yeah.
Was to have the goals distributed and have local governments amend and adopt their plans and ordinances based on the goals, to address the goals' requirements. And that's where we were scurrying, if that's the right word, or at least working very hard to line up people on staff who could give guidance to local governments as they were to proceed. And of course, we both know that there are how many counties in Oregon? 36.
Mm-hmm.
And we have 242 cities. I think we have one or two less right now, but anyway, the point was that we had that many cities, and if you step back and think, you gotta be kidding.
Yeah.
Here we're a staff of 10 or 15 people, including support staff, and we're gonna go out and tell the Oregon community, the communities plural,
right,
what they're supposed to do and when and how.
Yeah.
And what applies to us and what doesn't. I mean, we're not going to have a city have to worry about goal 3, the agricultural goal.
Yeah. As a backdrop to this, I'll just interject that I was working with Douglas County Planning, and I started in 1972, and we were working under Senate Bill 10. which was the forerunner basically to Senate Bill 100. And we were just finishing up zoning the county. And the one zone I remember when I started was a forest zone, which had a 5-acre minimum lot size. And the public at the time was outraged that we were even applying a minimum lot size of that size. And so from local government perspective, we had we called it an interim plan, but some counties actually had a plan under Senate Bill 10 adopted. And coming in with this new program, of course, our frame of reference was, well, how does this fit with the old program? And what's different? What do we have to do beyond what we've already done? And then as an aside, you might recall this, Fisano versus Washington County came in, a Supreme Court decision that was a landmark decision for us locally. And basically, it established the parameters for legislative and quasi-judicial process for permitting and legislative decision-making. And so all of a sudden, at the same time, basically, as you were coming out with the new program and the 14 goals, in context, we had a law that said this plan meant something more than anybody ever understood that it meant, and that it was a legislative process and everything had to. So as you were going out and defining the Goal 2 process, the court was involved in defining that as well. And it made for an interesting time for us locally to try to react to all this.
I think one of the big things in the goals was, in terms of addressing them, if you're local government, is the should versus shall.
Yes.
And having Goal 3 say you must or shall adopt and so forth in terms of process as well as lot size or whatever.
Well,
of course, that evolved over the years.
Basically protect Class 1 through 4 soils on the west coast.
On the west coast of 1 through 6.
Western Cascades and 1 through 6 in the east. Yeah, that was a major.
But the whole idea of having to have the state, now the state wasn't planning. And that was a big, big difference between Oregon and many other states where they might have had some direction and planning being done by the state government.
Yeah.
We didn't have that. The planning was going to be done and was done by cities and counties to comply with the goals, but also to address the interests and needs of the communities. And reconciling those requirements versus how a local government would perceive what the goal was asking them to do wasn't always automatic. It took some time to explain that to them.
Yeah.
And they would have differences of opinion and so forth. So we were trying to accomplish so much with so few people with very little time. And thankfully later, was it that year or the year after? I guess it was that year, we got more time given to us.
Yeah.
Was legislative act, I think?
Yeah, I think they granted the commission the ability to extend and to grant continuances was the language that we used, I guess, or extensions.
Extensions, right.
Which, and I don't think in fact I know, nobody really understood how long it was really going to take to go through the process.
Yeah, just to jump ahead,
and to get
the overall process, we would know, was about 10 years.
Right.
It doesn't mean that every jurisdiction it took 10 years. We had a couple of cities at the very beginning. Was it Medford?
Yeah, Medford and I have a note here. Medford and
what was the other one down in Southern Oregon?
Oh, let me look here real quick. Central Point.
Central Point, right.
Yeah, they were acknowledged.
In Jackson County.
I think in 1976.
They were the first ones.
Yeah, October 8th of 76, Medford and Central Point became the first cities to be approved.
And you could go off with our discussion here a little bit. You could probably say that if they had been submitted and reviewed later, they wouldn't have met it if they had to make some other changes. But
interesting.
I think the goalposts or whatever term you want to use was one that they found easy, not easy, but doable, whereas later on I think they would have found it more difficult.
Yeah.
Later on, of course, we both know the commission spent a lot of time and staff developing administrative rules.
Right.
And the goals more or less set out what the goal was in terms of what the subject was and the overall
Objective of what you're trying to achieve.
How do you do that?
Yeah.
Isn't always and wasn't
Right.
explicit.
Right.
And some goals were a lot longer than others, or more significant in some ways. And so we had to write rules that would tell them how to comply with the goals. Again, and this is a key point, I think, is that the goals represented the state's interest. And we hadn't ever really explained it that way probably clearly, because we weren't really totally sure ourselves.
Sure.
We knew that we weren't going to do the planning. Douglas County was, or
Yeah.
Polk County, or
Right.
or the city of Ashland, or whatever. And it took some thought to say, on our part, to explain how to address the goals and to comply with them. And that was not easy. And we later, soon, not after the goals were adopted, made some assignments to staff. And we didn't have field people in the fixed way that we had later on.
Yeah.
But like I had to go out and I worked with the Valley, to some extent, the Columbia Gorge, and Brett would have a certain part of Eastern Oregon and so forth. I think we had four or five of us. If you can imagine the few of us having to deal with all those communities.
Yeah.
And all of them were asking, what do we do now?
Yeah.
And how? And when? And where do we get money to help us do this? That was another big question, is that giving them, local governments, grants. But you have to have a request for application, or funds, excuse me, and that it would have to say, here, we need this much money to do the following things.
Yeah.
And we had to review those. And we didn't have all the money in the world, but we were giving out, in some cases, fairly handsome grants, like $25,000 or $30,000 or
Sure.
something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, as you can tell from our conversation that we've had ourselves over the years and other staff, it was a darn complicated time.
Yeah.
Very complicated.
Yeah. Well, and add to that the intensity of the issues, because we had jurisdictions, as you know, the county that I was working at, we were one of two counties that actually filed a suit against the whole idea of the state, requiring certain kinds of planning. And of course, Curry County, Douglas County lost that suit, but I think it gives you an idea of the
we had opposition
that was out there.
That's being kind.
Yeah.
We had some local governments that were just out and out, just terribly unhappy and
Right.
opposed
Right.
what we were doing, and took steps to try to prevent us from doing what we were supposed to do, and to give a basis for the local governments to say no.
Yes.
And those issues and questions just weren't there. That we had, and we argued about them, and we had great, I think, in my opinion, assistance from the Department of Justice, State Department of Justice, and the assistant AGs that would work with us. They were assigned to
Right.
be advisors to us, and they would come to commission meetings, and the commission would have a very intense discussion, and maybe Douglas County was over here, and pro-planning people were over here, and citizens and so forth, and then the chair would look up and say, Mr., who was one of our early people?
Yeah, Mike Reynolds.
Mike
probably
Reynolds,
would
thank
be
you.
one.
What's your advice here?
Yeah.
And we had, Steve Shell, who was a practicing attorney, and it was hard work, and the meetings would go on for, we would start at, 8:30 or 9, and go almost all day.
Yeah, incredible.
Maybe into the early evenings
Yeah.
sometimes.
Sometimes 2-day meetings, I know.
And we would be down in a different part of the state and so
Yeah.
forth. So it was a very, very demanding time in
Yeah.
terms of what we were being asked to do as staff. And the commission was, of course, in overall direction there. And it just took us a long time to sort things out, although we didn't have a long time. And so we got to working, and little by little, we started making some progress.
Yeah.
And we had to go out and explain things to local governments, and we're talking not just the county planning director, not just the planning commission members, sometimes we did that, the elected officials,
Yeah.
the county commissioners, or in the case of cities, city council people and mayors and so forth. And of course we were working very closely with, and we'll maybe talk about this up ahead, the League of Oregon Cities,
Uh-huh.
and the Association of Oregon Counties, as the name implies. These are the lobby organizations, the technical assistance organizations, who literally were across the street from us.
Yeah.
And
Next door, AO.
Well, yeah,
And
we were-
AOI was right.
right across the
Next
street.
door,
We had
too.
the Department of Justice over here.
Yeah.
And we had across the railroad tracks, so to speak. It really, literally was.
Yes.
And we worked closely with Gordon Foltz and a city person, what was his name?
Yeah. Burton was for a while.
Burton Wiest, right?
Yeah. Burton came in.
And these people, had their tasks and their assignments, but we worked pretty well together overall.
Yeah.
Yes, we would argue with one another more than a little at times, and they would come at times and testify before the commission, not just on a particular community's plan, but on the goals.
Sure, on the
So-
policy issue that you were
or in the
discussing.
interpretation
Right.
so, like for example, does a UTB have to be site specific? Or does the city and the county have to adopt the same line?
Yeah.
And do they have to agree that is the county about the areas outside city limits but inside the UTB?
Yeah.
And they have to agree to change zoning and adjust it to conform
And then
to
what do you
what
do
Bill
with-
14 was after.
What do you do with special districts? They come in and out of the
Special
lines,
districts. And we had-
I mean, it,
Darn it all, we had state
Yeah.
agencies, other state agencies that were involved. I should have mentioned that earlier, but we had about 10 or core agencies or so.
Yeah.
It was about 20 agencies altogether, but Fish and Wildlife, ODOT,
right.
Water Resources.
And they'd all make comments on
And
plans
and
as they
would
came
all-
in.
And they would have comments on policy issues, and helpful ones at times, other times
Right.
not so much, but we were all learning as we went.
And then
So-
Thousand Friends was adding
And
to
then we
the.
had Thousand Friends, and we had, Association of, Indus AOI next door.
Right.
And that's right, they were behind us there.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were surrounded, literally. And, just getting to a consensus. And sometimes the commission voted in ways that maybe the local government didn't like, obviously,
Sure.
or some of the, interest groups didn't like. And sometimes the votes were close, like 4-3 or something like that. But and then the time would go on as we would have new commissioners join, the commission, and had to work with them and explain things to them.
Right.
And
How we got to this point. And
that's right.
bring them up to
So we
speed.
had to bring them along, and we got more staff as the agency matured, and new directors came on, and it became a very complicated setup,
Yeah.
complicated arrangement, or whatever the right word is in terms of how we pulled it all together.
Well, it really was a monumental task. I mean, to think about it, think back on it.
If you and I step back and think, gosh, 40 years have passed, and we left about, 2/3 of the way through,
Yeah.
and so things are still going.
Yeah.
All 19 goals, as we both know, were not adopted at the same time. We got the first 14. Next came Goal 15, which was the
Willamette Greenway.
And then a year or two later came 4 more goals specific to the coast. So Could there have been more subjects? I suppose so. Could there have been fewer? I suppose so, but they seemed to fall into place, and it was a big load for counties and cities on the coast to have to deal with 19 subjects. Now, number 19 is the ocean goal, so to speak, dealt with issues offshore.
Right.
But the other three, depending upon your geography and how you were located, it was beaches and dunes if you were next to the beach, shorelands, and what was the last one? Estuaries.
Oh yeah, that was a big, very controversial.
Sure it was.
Yeah.
And telling them how to deal with very, very complicated natural resources. We had to have some expertise ourselves, and we had to rely on others to some extent.
Well, that's where Ted LaRoe.
Ted LaRoe and others.
He was on loan from NOAA, I believe.
Yeah. And we very, very fortunate, and I guess we've said this before, and you'll hear it again, and you believe it yourself. But we had an incredible staff of not that many numbers, but we all worked together pretty well.
Yeah.
Yes, we had arguments.
Did you have did the OCC and DC, the Oregon Coastal Conservation Development Commission, they had staff members, I remember working with Glenn and Becky and some of them, Peter, did they come to the department and work with the department?
They became our staff.
Okay, and they focused primarily on the coastal issues?
I mean, and we wanted them to do that.
Yeah, because they
if you were to ask me, what's the difference between a such and such estuary here versus there, and so on size, or beaches on different types of beaches and dunes and so forth, or shorelands, how far back and so forth. And
they've been working on those issues for years.
Right, and they were getting money, Oregon was getting money to fund their efforts, and so the money that they were getting, OCC and DC, then come to us, and we had a coastal division, or a unit, or whatever you want to call it, that was responsible for those goals.
Yeah.
In addition to the case might be, 14 goals.
Yeah, I remember they had 4 staff members.
And so we had to integrate our, regular earlier staff with coastal staff, and we all got along pretty well, I think. And sometimes issues were pretty critical, and they would go to the commission for interpretation, which is hard to believe, but that's just the way it was. And but I think the thing that I look back on, and this is sort of like almost a closing comment, but I'm not closing anything out,
Okay.
but to be part of something that was so unique.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to come to an agency, and it's been there for 20 or 30 years already, and ours was a brand new organization, and we had to make it up as we went along, and that wasn't easy.
Yeah.
It wasn't
for
easy.
sure.
And yet we did it, and we made a huge contribution to Oregon. I can read you if you want to hear what Governor McCall thought of his opening remarks in 1973. You probably have heard these words before, but I thought I might read them.
Yeah, go ahead. I think it'd be.
So this is Governor McCall's opening address. Quoting now, "Oregon is an inspiration even to those who do not come here to live. The story of the Willamette River, our ecological Easter, has evoked cries of hurrah across the nation and in distant parts of the world. And we have heard, along with the applause for Oregon, lamentation for other states where progress has fell prey to expediency. But there is a shameless threat to our environment and to the whole quality of life. Unfettered despoiling of the land, sagebrush subdivisions, coastal condominium, and the ravenous rampage of suburbia in the Willamette Valley all threaten to mock Oregon's status as the environmental model of the nation. We are in dire need of a state land use policy, new subdivision laws, and new standards for planning and zoning by cities and counties. The interests of Oregon for today and in the future must be protected from grasping wastrels of the land.
I remember that.
We must respect another truism that unlimited and unregulated growth leads inexorably to a lower quality of life. We are talking about more than preserving the beauty of Oregon. We are talking about the growth of Oregon and how that growth can be accomplished in the same manner. We are talking about the economy and the environment. We are talking about balance. In short, we're talking about people and the land. I mean, he was quite a speaker.
He was a great orator.
And he captured, you know, at a high level, what the importance of what we were doing and the difficulty of not doing it.
And I think you said this. He thought this was his signature legislation.
He did. When he signed the bill,
Yeah.
he felt it was the most momentous piece of legislative action that he had, up to that point, had seen. And, you know, he was the one that approved it. He was a great governor to have at that time. Sometimes the timing of things is not right.
It is.
You know, you have the right law to work on and get passed, but not the leadership that you need, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And he had both.
And of course, we were coming off of Earth Day, and I mean, I think that the time that we lived in back and then.
And the Bauer bill,
promoted.
the beach bill, and,
Yeah.
you know, some of these other enactments
Yeah.
that were very, very significant. And here we were, you know, working to put a land use program together for a state of Oregon whose, area is 10th in the nation in size.
Yeah.
And, you know, 52% or whatever is federally owned.
At the same time, they were talking about a national land use bill, and it never survived. So it was unique that Oregon ended up having a program like this.
And to jump ahead, out of order, I'm sure, but this week, I guess, the president's going to be signing some other of his executive orders, and one of them, the subject-wise,
This is President Trump, by the way.
is dealing with federal lands.
Yeah.
And I'm just very, very worried that it's going to be something
Right. That will.
very, you know.
Yeah.
That's right. So
It'll be very interesting to see where that goes.
I don't want to think about it too much.
Yeah.
How am I doing? Is that?
Oh, you're doing great. Before I jump off that, I want to ask you a few moments to talk about some of the staff members that you remember. Herb Riley, Walt McCallum were two staff members I know were instrumental in the early days of the program and are here to speak on behalf of the program now.
Walt was head of our little unit. He was a manager of the people that worked on goal interpretations and developing those subjects, and he was very, very helpful because he had come from ODOT and had a good grasp of Oregon, and he was very, how do I say this, very good to work with, not under necessarily. In fact, if we step back and ask how was it working at the agency at the beginning, we didn't have a lot of layers. Yes, we had a director and so forth, but the rest of us, we obviously had some people who were directed by other people, but generally speaking, we were all working together to make this work.
Yeah.
So, Rupp Riley was, I think, deputy director under Arnold.
And did he come from
He
transportation?
came from the COG.
Oh, he did. Okay.
Yeah.
Mid-Willamette Valley.
Mid-Valley.
Okay.
Right. And he was what I would like to say. This is not anything written down, but my mentor in terms of, what is a goal, or how's a goal to be interpreted, and those are interesting questions to ask. But you'd have to write. We would say have a letter going out to Douglas County that would maybe be asking, how does Goal 5 work really, or whatever the question was, or what's a direction to counties and cities in developing a UGB and so forth. And I and others would write letters and have maybe meetings with local governments and so forth, and we had to have it pretty well thought through, so we would take stuff into Herb's office.
Yeah.
And he wasn't the most jovial person, but he would say, good, on this point, let's rewrite this one point, or no, I don't agree with that.
Is this where you learned your red pen technique?
I guess, used against me at times, right.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, he was a mentor.
Well, that's what I learned from you when I came from Douglas County, connecting the facts with the issue.
And the conclusions.
Yeah, and to make sure they all matched up was something that,
and was consistent,
yes,
too. Well, I mean, everybody's different.
Right.
What the issue about Douglas County's ag zone and Jackson County's ag zone.
Sure.
If there were some similarities, how are they connected in ways that were what they should be?
And if they were different, what facts supported that difference? So
Yeah,
you
if you
can
had,
justify.
It's one thing to have a crop of wheat or hay,
and then pear orchards on the other side.
Pear orchards or something. And how do we keep those connected in a generalized sense,
right,
but recognizing that, say, minimum lot size
could be different
and in fact were different. And how do we explain that in ways that would make sense and be clear for them to understand? Whether they agree with it or not is another matter.
Right.
But
well, and then setting a public policy that if the commission approved this, that other counties would adopt that or would try to get that if the, you had to make sure the standard fit the situation or the lowest common denominator would occur.
And if we had an interpretation made for another county that made sense and the commission agreed with, and then we had another set of facts that were close to the ones we just approved, to communicate that to that other county, and they have to re-explain over again why this made sense. And in some ways it made our jobs a little easier if we didn't have to reinvent.
Sure.
But Walt and Herb, and John Gustafson were the people that we worked under, and they were all different, but they all seemed to come together.
Yeah.
And they were good to work for and underneath. I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but you know what I'm trying to say is that we got along, and we were all pulling the rope together. And yes, we would have disputes, and sometimes I'd have two people that would strongly disagree with an interpretation that I was trying to sell, and I wasn't above taking the issue, not every day of course, into Herb or into Walt and say, is this the correct interpretation we want to take out?
What do you think? Yeah.
And some of them were so fundamental and critical, we would take them to the commission. We would say, we have a staff review of so-and-so county's ordinance for this or that, and in that, we're making the interpretation that they don't meet it because, or they do meet it because.
Right.
And yet they were so critical to use elsewhere and sharing with other staff and so forth.
Well, and realizing that you'd have probably 1,000 friends on one side and maybe people from AOI on the other side, or
with the counties.
Or counties themselves.
Counties were themselves, and
will be there arguing.
And we would have,
in support
strongly worded county planning directors or city planning directors who would come in, and understandably they were arguing in their interests, their jurisdiction's interests before us, and they had to have their time before the commission, and sometimes the commission would say, that's not a bad point you're making, or I'm sorry, but the staff's interpretation is one we're going to support.
Yeah.
And doing that over and over again. Now, as time went on, we would have a series of, examples and interpretations that were going to stand up. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time somebody came in with a similar set of issues.
Well, and then if there was an appeal of the commission decision, it would go to the Court of Appeals.
Right.
And I will say, from at least my tenure at the department, most of the time the Court of Appeals supported the commission.
Yeah, this is before LUBA was, established.
Right.
And
but even then, acknowledgments would go to the Court of Appeals,
Yes.
and generally they were upheld.
They were upheld.
And when they weren't upheld, we had to go back and scramble
we had to scramble
and maybe rewrite a goal or rule. I remember doing that
we had
on
to be,
occasion.
we had to be flexible. And I don't mean to be soft, but we had to be able to take what was told to us,
Yeah.
and if we agree with it, say, the Court of Appeals has sustained the commission's decision on such and such ordinance. Or if it didn't, or modified it a little bit, we have to take it back and maybe even rewrite an interpretation, or rewrite, or at least reinterpret a goal's requirement. And this is before we had the rules. But once we had the rules, then that started, of course it meant paper started building up a little bit, but we would have guidance. And that's a key word here is, we're not saying every single word was the same no matter where you would apply it, other than should or shall. But,
Yeah.
but the rules would lay out, how to interpret certain goals or goal provisions. And that would help us a lot as time went on. It did. Acknowledgement was a time of our lives,
Yeah.
professionally, I mean, that you wouldn't want to live that forever, but we were together and we were working and applying them statewide, and getting results. We were out there protecting the land and doing what the goals were asking us to do.
Yeah.
Now,
It may have taken a jurisdiction 2 or 3 tries to get through the process.
sometimes we would approve let's say, that part of the county's plan,
Right.
or those provisions.
Or a couple of goals. You'd
A
say
couple of goals.
you
You're there on that.
you
but-
complied with goals,
Right.
And
so you get another continuance, and maybe we even threw a little money in sometimes if necessary, but
mostly for database, factual-based
database,
improvement.
right. And we would try to connect them with state agencies that would be helpful to them in addressing some of those data requirements. So,
Do you remember your varying assignments? I know when I arrived at Department of Land Conservation Development, you were, I think you were the, how would you describe it, the coordinator or maybe the manager of the rural section? Is that a fair way to
I guess
describe
so,
it?
yeah.
And then I remember you going off and doing state agency coordination.
Near the end of my time with the agency.
Well, yeah, toward the latter part, but
Yes.
you came back in as a manager, so
Yeah,
you kind of moved
yeah.
around.
Right.
Spend a moment on the state agency coordination, because I remember you going off and you had, I don't know how many agencies to review, and if my recollection's correct, you would try and measure what those programs did against the statewide planning goals.
We had to identify let's say an agency had 10 programs that we were reviewing them for. We had to make decisions as to whether or not those programs were either affected by or affected one or more of the goals.
Okay.
And so they had to have then procedures to address that concern. And so those are called programs affecting land use. And that's a broad term,
Yeah.
phrase.
So you'd have to analyze each of their programs and then measure that against whether you thought it affected land use.
And in many cases, the agencies were more than happy to have some guidance about that.
Uh-huh.
Fish and Wildlife, or ODOT, and the water resources. And not every agency's set of programs affected the same goals.
Right.
We're not going to ask such and such agency to comply with Goal 14, but to ensure that when you were interpreting Goal 5 regarding, say, water resources, or Goal, let's say, 7,
Yeah.
for natural hazards with GAMI, we were all pulling together, and the agencies generally were very supportive of what we were doing. because frankly, the agencies didn't have a lot of staff people to send out and deal with land use issues.
Yeah.
They might have one or two people.
Yeah.
And ODOT would have a few more, obviously, and Forestry would have a few more.
So did they view the outcome as if DLCD said this didn't affect land use, the counties and cities didn't have to worry about dealing with that permitting process, or how did that?
It gets tricky. I think local governments had to comply with the goals.
Right.
And certain provisions clearly applied to the local governments. Other provisions maybe were more general and would apply to both agencies and local governments.
Okay.
But we tried to demystify some of the stuff as best we could. That isn't the right term to use, but to explain more clearly what an agency's obligations were and what a local government's obligations were to comply.
Okay.
And usually if the agency was acting in accord with the local government's plan for the same topic they were both concerned about, we would say to the state agency, yeah, you don't have to comply with the goal independent of the local government. If you comply with the agency's ordinance, then you're meeting what the goal's after.
With the agencies or the
agencies.
local government? Okay.
I mean, I'm saying if a local government's zoning ordinance required a certain list of uses or something like that,
Uh-huh.
the state agency can't come along and say, well, I don't care what the ordinance says, we approve of what the local government's doing or not doing, rather. And so we had to sort of be the referee at times, and in the staff, at the staff level. We didn't have to take everything to the commission, but by having a state agency coordination program, which was ultimately they had to adopt certain rules themselves,
Yeah.
the agencies, then they were satisfying what I think the statute was after. It was 197, 180.
Okay. Yeah.
And I did that how many times? But it was the core agencies that meant the most to us, I think. We weren't going to worry about some of the smaller ones. Not that they're not important in and of themselves, but it was the key agencies that were the most important.
Yeah.
And LCDC has all those agreements down there. The question is, wait a minute now, let's see, this is 19, no, it's 2017 or 2000, whatever it's going to be.
Yeah.
Have things changed? Or should they change? Have you adopted new rules? Has the legislature given you new programs to carry out? And do those programs have a land use implication?
Do they affect land use? Yeah.
Are we asking those questions? Do we have an agency coordination person at the LCD anymore?
Yeah, I don't know the current
I don't know
situation
that either, but I'm saying that it makes complete sense
Yeah.
to think that, yes, they're going to have some issues come up. That, what's the direction here from the LCD? Do we have to change something? Or are we, where are we on this? And maybe we do talk to the agencies still along those lines. My hunch is that we're not doing a lot of that.
Certainly not at the degree you were doing.
No.
Do you remember when that started? Was it the mid-'80s you started your first?
Well, it was in the statutes.
Right, but I mean, you actually you were the state agency coordinator, I believe. I remember.
It was like in the latter part of my career there.
Yeah.
I think maybe
Late 80s, because we were getting...
Mid to late 80s probably, and
that took you how long to do all of the...
maybe 5 or 6 years or so, and but generally speaking, the agency people I worked with were good people.
Oh, yeah.
Like the Ted Lawrences of the world.
Right.
I'm not trying to pull Ted's name out of the air.
No.
But,
Well, Rick
or
Bastash
Rick
had a lot of
Bastash,
resources.
One
I mean, you had
resources.
people that were...
Yeah. And
Many of them followed the land use
and the
program
ODOT people.
on its own.
And
I mean,
that's right.
Fish and Wildlife, of
Fish and
course,
Wildlife,
was
we
very
had,
active.
What was his name there? I've lost some track of the names, but I found them a good group to
Dennis
work with.
Homestead, I remember.
Thank you. And sometimes we would bring people together.
For Dogami.
We would maybe have a multi-agency discussion.
Yeah.
Either because we were all talking about a certain jurisdiction's plan, or we had a general issue that was going to apply to a number of local governments. And so the agency would want to know, what's your direction? Because it wasn't obvious to them.
Yeah.
I'm not being unfair. I just think that some of those issues were new to all of us. And we would have to sit back and, like the energy department. And maybe that was a mixture of state requirements and federal requirements for
True.
energy facilities. Yeah. And so how do we untie that?
Yeah.
It wasn't our job to untie it, but to give guidance to the agency and to local governments and other interest
But it
groups.
was complicated, certainly.
It was complicated.
Yeah.
Sometimes there were legal issues involved. And so our attorney, Mike Reynolds or whoever it was,
Yeah.
and then the agency might have somebody else at DOJ,
True. Yeah.
a different person.
Yeah.
And
They'd have to get
I
together.
would say to them gently, you guys go off and talk this through and come back and see if you have agreement.
Give us both guidance, both
That's
agencies'
right.
guidance.
That's right. And so, again, it's part of this network of issues.
Yeah. Very complex.
Complex, but we worked our way through it, and we had some very, very bright people in the agency who were, like Greg Winterroot, or, some of these people who were just
Yeah.
good at what they were doing.
Yeah.
Or they were excellent in terms of speaking, and just a range of people. And some were really good dealing with their local governments if they were a field person.
Yeah.
And they needed to know when to call home, so to speak, and ask a question, and when they were on their own. And we would have staff meetings, and you remember those, of
Oh,
course.
for sure.
And we would have people who are the staff, the field people, as well as the subject or,
Yeah.
issue people.
And the field reps often became advocates for local government,
They did.
and our
And
staff
they-
people come be advocates for the policy position the department was
And
taking.
it was my job
And
to
you
try
need
to reconcile
Yeah,
them.
you need to
I
get
remember
them.
having meetings with, Douglas County or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And we would have, dealing with various parts of the plan. And, so-and-so was the agency's representative
Yeah.
there. And I wasn't there to take names or favor one or the other, but how do I pull all this together?
Right.
You know?
Well, you had to match it up with the commission's positions.
I did, where there was one. In some cases we had, okay.
Sorry, I'm right. Okay, I've got one more question for you here. Is the state land use program equipped to address and properly respond to major changes in Oregon, i.e. population growth, economy, climate change, environment, affordable housing, etc., over the next 30 to 40 years, or do you think changes are needed? What do you think about that?
Good question. Listening to your words and the thoughts that were with them, I think that we're not properly equipped today to deal with major changes as you have described them or defined them.
Okay.
Over the next 30 to 40 years, you think, and I think over that period, things will be needed. What will they be? That's too difficult to answer now, or at least it's something that takes some more thought and discussion as to what changes are we talking about. Are we talking legislative change? Are we talking changes in state goals or rules or procedures? Are we talking about funding issues? Are we talking about multi-agency efforts? There's lots of avenues that we ought to think about, and can't answer today. But
Are these external changes, like climate change is something that we vision
yes,
happening?
I think the things I'm rattling off here or listing off
Right.
are things that are external to the land use program,
Okay.
but some vary more than others in terms of they fall within the purview of the agency's program, the land use program, like population change or other changes in natural resources or housing costs or whatever that might be.
Yeah.
So We aren't necessarily equipped to deal with some of those, so I think we should look ahead and prepare ourselves for dealing with some of those things, which may include every so often reviewing the situation in various communities around the state.
So some of these issues will affect some communities differently than others.
I think we're talking in many cases faster growing communities than others, or others that are maybe more reliant on natural resource industries that maybe are changing or will be changing.
Right.
It could be, again, as you were saying a moment ago, climate change could be a major factor.
Yeah.
So there isn't a yes or no that's answering all circumstances. I think that we ought to think about having some changes in terms of procedure and policies that we can bring into effect to address some of the concerns.
Basically something that triggers a discussion
Exactly,
of
right.
evaluating a plan per se or ordinances.
And I think we should probably every so often do a check of every city's plan and county, but whether that triggers in response or a response from them in one way or another is not, we can't answer that because it all depends upon what the review produces.
Right.
And some will be more significant and major than others.
Yeah. And of course these external changes affect communities in different ways. So.
And it may affect multiple communities.
Yeah.
We're not talking a little city out in the middle of nowhere, quote unquote.
Yeah.
We're maybe talking a whole region or a sub-area of a county or something like
Yeah.
that. And so we need to be flexible in terms of what we have that will be used and ready to go if and when those circumstances exist.
Okay, we're getting ready to wrap up your interview, and I think you wanted to close with a statement.
Thanks very much. It's been really a good time to work with you today and have my words hopefully properly recorded. We'll leave off the visual part. Let me conclude my part of the interview today with some remarks by reading a quote from the person who I consider is one of the program's true patriarchs, and the one in many ways is the reason we are all here and talking about these issues we've been covering this morning. This person, of course, is Hector McPherson. Now here are his inspiring words expressed back in 1992 about the birth of the program and its importance for Oregon's future. No, I did not know what I was creating. I think the most remarkable thing is that we are here 20 years later, after the enactment of Senate Bill 100 in 1973, and that it has been enough of a success to last at least this long. I knew that land use was a tremendously divisive type of thing. When I got into this thing, none of the other legislators except Ted Hallett wanted to join me because they didn't feel it was anything that would enhance their political stature. And of course, we've had a number of times since then when I wondered if it was going to last through the next election. So I guess the most delightful thing is that it really is still here and that it has gotten some national recognition and that it's recognized at least by some people in the state of Oregon as having been desirable. I just hope with all the uncertainty I see out there in the future that we can progress at least as well in the future as we have in the past. I really have some confidence that the voters are sensible to recognize the strength of a program like this. Thank you, Hector, for your kind words.
I'm going to hand you a copy of all the awards this program has been honored with since.
Where's your name?
Very interesting. Well, yours is on there, of course. But,
I should be there with others.
well, but I mean, how many are there's probably 10 or 12 national awards and things. It's
I think I have a
Quite an
version of this someplace, but thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding me of what I've learned.
We've devoted your career to this, so
Yeah.
that's great.
I'm now 70 years old. Is this still running now? Or?
Of course. Let me close by saying, on behalf of Portland State University and those of us involved in the Oral History Project, I'd like to thank you for your time. I really appreciated hearing about your role and your thoughts about Oregon's land use program.
Thanks, Mike.